We have got a ton to do today, and I'm in a chatty mood. That's a bad combination. You noticed? Okay, good. Well, I just thought I would acknowledge what everybody is already aware of. Daniel chapter 11, we're actually wrapping up this morning the book of Daniel. You say, but Pastor, there are 2 chapters left in the book. I know, that's why we've got a lot to do today. So Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12. We begin on page 473 of your, if you're using one of the Pew Bibles there, if you're in your own Bible, you're kind of on your own there. But we live in a world where madness, and anger for that matter, but madness seems to reign more and more. Those of you who are a little bit older, you probably recognize it more. I'm just now starting to, I think, realize that the world seems like its chaos has been multiplying over definitely the course of my lifetime. And that really madness just reigns more and more. People do whatever they want, and they have fewer filters, and they seem like they are wary of fewer ramifications than ever. It wasn't that long ago where the idea of, and it's actually been given a name since. Back in the day, we just called it being a kid. Now they're called free-range kids. Parents who believe in free-range parenting. And by that, they mean they let their kids do whatever they want, just, when the street lights come on, come home kind of idea. Back when I was a kid, that was pretty normal. You go back another generation or two, and everybody did it. You do it today, and they label you, and then they take your kids away. Because we live in a day where it's not safe to do that. I as a parent do not behave in any way like my parents did. Forget, when the street lights are on, come home. My philosophy is just stay home. If I can't see you, that's a problem. If my kids are going to go somewhere, Kate or I or another adult relative with a cell phone is going with them. Because it's not safe to let kids just roam free anymore. At least it doesn't feel safe. Have you noticed that? It's just me. I know somebody said that, total paranoia is total awareness, and so maybe I'm just very aware or very paranoid, I'm not sure. But I think it's true. I think that's the world that we live in. And as believers, we begin to sense that it's even worse because the dangers that life itself poses seem to be amplified because popular opinion is beginning to turn or continuing to turn or increasingly turning against us as being the people of God. And so we see that. And on the one hand, we're surprised every time we're confronted with the reality of this world that we live in. But on the other hand, we shouldn't be because the world really has always been this way. There have been times of relative safety, maybe. There have been times when the madness of the world abated a little bit, maybe. But by and large, the world has long been a dangerous, crazy, chaotic place. Daniel, as his prophecies culminate here in chapters 11 and 12, really detail the enduring reality of the world that we know. The enduring reality of madness, the enduring reality of danger, the enduring reality of chaos is chronicled throughout much of human history, but certainly here in the last couple chapters of Daniel. And so I'd invite your attention, Daniel chapter 11. Now, Daniel chapter 11, we're really going to back up one verse, if that's okay, and we're going to get a running start at Daniel 11 because Daniel 11 starts with something that is connected to the end of Daniel chapter 10. Really, they keep going. But we begin Daniel 11 with a glance behind. And this can, admittedly, there is so much in chapter 11 that can get a little confusing. So hopefully we won't lose you along the way. But if we start in chapter 10 and I'll pick it up in verse 20. Get a really good running start at it. Then he said, "Do you know why I have come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia." And so we have this messenger angel that is talking to Daniel. the one that freaked him out because he showed up in combat mode instead of messenger mode, who kind of changed gears, and he's been talking with Daniel. He says, look, when I'm done giving you this message, I got to go back and fight. And so we get the whole spiritual warfare thing still open for us here. And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. And then he gives us what is, in some Bibles, is marked out with a parenthesis. And I think that's a great tool because it helps us to see it stands apart. But even if it doesn't, it's almost an aside that this angel gives, that he's talking to Daniel, and then he's like just talking to an unnamed audience, just kind of an aside. I don't know if you're familiar with that kind of grammatic thing. It's, it happens in plays. It's kind of like breaking the, what do they call it, breaking the fourth wall, when the actor starts talking to the audience directly, and you get that, and you almost get that kind of sense here, the angel. He says, no one upholds me against these, the prince of Greece, the prince of Persia, except Michael, your prince. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now, if you don't read those two verses together, you will get confused because you have too many pronouns there to follow. I withstood him. Well, who's the I and who's the him? If you just start in Daniel chapter 11, verse 1, you think that Daniel is talking to you and that he stood up to strengthen Darius the Mede. That is actually absolutely wrong. The I there actually refers to the angel who is speaking to Daniel, and the him could be Darius, but more directly, he's talking about Michael. So here's what happens. We think about it. Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1, what year of Cyrus rule, or Darius rule, and they're the same guy, so you read two different names, same guy. Darius the Mede is his Median name, Cyrus the king is his Persian name, same guy. So in Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1, what year is the angel appear? The third year. Okay, so Daniel chapter 11, he says in the first year, 2 years ago. So this is an aside where he says, now 2 years ago, so he says, look, I'm out here fighting. Michael came out and he helped me. 2 years ago, I came out and I helped him. It is the interplay when you sort out through all the pronouns. So he's writing in the third year of Cyrus. In the first year of Darius, there were actually several things that were very significant and very important that happened. Most notably, we find from the book of Ezra, is that in the first year of Cyrus, as he became king and conquered Babylon and conquered the world under his control, one of the early things he did in that first year of his reign was he gave the Jews permission to return from Babylon to Jerusalem. He did that in the first year of his reign. Now, is it important for the Jews to be in Israel, not in Babylon? Yeah, prophetically speaking, Messiah was going to be born. He was going to be born in Israel. He was going to live in a nation of Israel. He was going to eventually be crucified in the city of Jerusalem by the Jews. It was essential that there be Jews and a nation in Israel for prophecy to be fulfilled. So, critical thing for the Jews to go back to their homeland. Do you think that the adversary of the Jews, and we share that adversary, would have wanted them to go home? What do you think? If there's spiritual warfare, as we talked about last week, as we saw really exposed for us in Daniel chapter 10, if the devil were going to fight against anything, if the devil were going to try to influence the Cyrus in any way, shape, or form, wouldn't it be to keep the Jews in Babylon? Does that make sense to you? As they exert their influence, as they exert their pressure, as they combat in the spiritual arena. And here's Michael, the Prince of Israel. One of his functions as archangel, aside from what he does for God, is to watch over God's people. And so here's Michael doing battle with the Prince of Persia, the kings of Persia. And here's this messenger angel, also a warrior. It says, in that first year, Michael was in a strait. I came down and helped. And here I am trying to get through because I needed to give you a message. I was in a strait. He came and helped. And so we just get this very cool continued picture into the spiritual world and into spiritual conflict. And so, that's okay. And so just be aware as you start reading chapter 11, verse 1. Verse 1 is very confusing if you don't sort through all of the stuff together. And so there's a lot of detail that we have to follow to make sure that we get the right understanding. But see that he's looking back at this great event where God made sure that his people were back in the land, that this angel was personally involved in the spiritual conflict, in the influence of the human decision that Cyrus made to make sure the people went back to the land of Israel. You say, did Cyrus make that decision? Yes. Did he make it himself? Yes. Did he make it of his own free will as king of the known world? Yes. Was it in accordance with God's will and plan? Yes. So many of the things that we choose to do freely do function in God's will. It's a great thing. And so, having kind of given us that glance behind it a couple years ago, the angel then turns his attention to a look ahead. And we begin in verse 2, and this goes all the way out to about verse 35, and we see this great prophetic text, one of the most densely packed prophetic texts anywhere in your Bible, and he begins to look ahead. And I'm not going to read the whole thing too. We're going to read a couple verses here. But he details things to Daniel that are future to Daniel, but are now history to us, which puts us in a very interesting position because we can see and we can read and we can understand and we can document the things that this angel told Daniel that were coming, that have since come. And so he begins by saying that there was going to be Persian kings that culminated in a guy named Xerxes I who instigated against Greece. Look at in verse 2. He said, "Now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece." And so we know, historically speaking, this is a guy named Xerxes I. He wasn't the last king of Persia, but he was the last one of consequence as far as God was concerned, because this king, in his wealth and in his power, kind of went up and tweaked the nose of Alexander the Great. Bad idea, because Alexander the Great took it up personally and decided that he needed to go overrun Persia as he did. And so introduces us in verse 3 to this Greek king. Then a mighty king shall arise, speaking of Alexander the Great, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And so he refers us to Alexander the Great, and it's interesting, and I'm just having you note this, according to his will. This phrase pops up several times in these last couple of chapters. We've already seen Cyrus, who really, according to his own will and choice, though in following God's will and plan, did something. Here we see Alexander the Great, who did anything he wanted according to his own will. And so Alexander was a mighty king, was an empire builder. Didn't last very long, but man, a lot of power in the process, did according to his own will. We keep going to verse 4. "And when he is risen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others beside these." Historically speaking, we know that Alexander had 2 sons, both of whom were murdered, and so the Greek empire that he established was divided between 4 of his generals, none of whom ever commanded the entire area or an entire area as large as Alexander's. It literally shrunk the minute he died. It was divided into 4 chunks, the net of all 4 of which were smaller than the whole that Alexander had ruled over, if but briefly. And so we find that these 4 kingdoms, and we've talked about this a couple times, that these 4 kingdoms were there. He continues talking about this, that there would be a multi-generational conflict between these 2 kingdoms. We find it in verses 5, really through the end of verse 35. And he begins to focus specifically on 2 kingdoms, and he talks about the king of the south. Now, you're going to see this if you read through it several times. The king of the south is a reference to Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic kingdom that was centered largely in Egypt. And then he refers to the king of the north, and the king of the north refers to the Seleucid kingdom that was centered largely out of Syria. Now, it wasn't that the other two kingdoms were not existent and doing their thing, but what do you have sandwiched between Egypt and Syria? Israel. And so these two kings, the Ptolemaic kingdoms and the Seleucid kingdoms, are going to be in a multi-generational state of conflict running up and down the length of Israel, because that's kind of the border, the demilitarized zone between them. Not really demilitarized, because they're going to keep crossing it, and possession or rule over Israel is going to pass back and forth between these two kingdoms several times. And so multi-generational, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations of kings of the north and kings of the south. And so as you read it, you're going to read the king of the north is going to do this, the king of the south is going to do this, the king of the north, the king of the south. The king of the south is the Ptolemaic kingdom, the king of the north is the Seleucid kingdom. What's interesting is, if I were to say to you, how many of you know the name Cleopatra? How many would raise your hand? Okay. She's actually in this text. Not by name, but the daughter of the king of the south would be married to the son of the king of the north. That's Cleopatra. Your history and what you see here in the book of Daniel mesh really well. And so you could spend a lot of time, if you spent much time reading between the conflict between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms, you could cross-reference this to Daniel chapter 11 and see it all play out exactly as this angel was declaring to Daniel. And so you have these two kingdoms in this state of multi-generational conflict. Eventually, the Seleucid kingdom basically wins out, and we see that in verse 16 hinted at. But he, the Seleucid king, or the king of the north, who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. And so the angel says, this Seleucid king, this king of the north, is going to stand, and he's going to do everything according to his will. And again, we see that phrase. It's very important. And he's going to stand in the glorious land. Where's the glorious land? That's the land of Israel. You see that several times, the glorious land. That's a land, that's just a description of the land of Israel. Daniel, at 85 years old, is looking longingly for home. And in his mind, regardless of what the place may look like and how overrun it may have been, that's the glorious land, because that's God's land. That's the land of God's people. It's glorious to Daniel. And so he says, look, this kingdom, ultimately this conflict between these two kingdoms culminates with the arrival and the arising of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the eighth Seleucid king. Now, Antiochus is a guy that we've talked about once or twice. He's the prototype, the forerunner of Antichrist. And so we find him arising, if you jump down to verse 31 of chapter 11. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifice and place there the abomination of desolation. And we've talked about how Antiochus IV, as he waged battle back and forth, fighting against the Ptolemies, fighting against the Romans, eventually he gets into Jerusalem, and he murders the high priest, sets up his own high priest, and then eventually takes away the daily sacrifice, and then reinforces that command by going into the temple and erecting an altar to Zeus and sacrificing a pig on that altar, defiling the temple, and temple sacrifice stops because it can't go on. The temple itself is unclean and defiled. And so here's Antiochus IV getting to this place. And that brings us to the end of verse 35. And the end of verse 35 is this densely packed area of prophecy that for us is history. You look at this in these 35 verses, there are at least 135 distinct prophecies in those 35 verses that have been literally fulfilled and historically documented. History meshes perfectly with what this angel described would happen it had not happened yet. It is among the most detailed prophecies that you will find anywhere in Scripture, and it happened exactly the way God said it was going to happen. Now that, for my money, is cool, and there's just no way around it. It's just awesome. You start reading through the history of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid conflict, and it just matches perfectly with the way God said it was going to happen. And so you have this look ahead, which for us is a look back at history. And it reinforces for us the fact that God actually knows what's going on. We get to verse 36, and I would say from there, he begins to look even further ahead. And the reason I say further ahead, because when you hit verse 36, he now begins to recount things that have not happened yet. 21st century America, verse 36 on, has not happened yet. And so it gets very interesting, very cool, but he begins talking about this one who would come like Antiochus IV, but he's talking about the Antichrist. The details that he gives us in these verses do not correlate to Antiochus himself. And we go on, and we can see it if we pick up in verse 36. Then the king shall do according to his own will. Again, we run across that phrase, doing according to his own will. It happens too often in this chapter not to note it. He'll exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. Now that does not describe Antiochus IV. Antiochus worshipped whom? We know. Zeus, because he erected an altar to Zeus, sacrificed a pig to Zeus on the altar of Zeus in the temple, just the same way his fathers had done. The one who is coming does not recognize any god outside of himself. Won't worship the God of his fathers. Verse 38, but in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, a God of power, and a God which his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign God, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. And so this one who is coming is not anything like the one who had been here before. The conflict that we see here described in verses 40 through verse 45 is future to us and will be a time of great trouble. So let's jump to chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. That sounds interestingly familiar, doesn't it? And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. There's going to be a time of great trouble. We find that there will be a time of 3.5 years of trouble that culminates in the shattering, literally that's the word used, of the Jewish people. Look in verse 7 of chapter 12. Then I heard the man clothed in linen, speaking of an angel, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever, speaking of God, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. And so this time that the angel is prophesying is going to be a time of 3.5 years of conflict that's going to culminate in the literal shattering of the Jewish people. They're just going to be unhinged, completely undone. And we find that at that point there's going to be this abomination of desolation. And then there's going to be an additional period of trouble where God will judge the earth. If you flip over to verse 11, we're going to bounce a little bit here in chapter 12. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up. And so we have here now, speaking of the Antichrist, just like we were speaking of Antiochus IV historically, there is going to be a time where the daily sacrifice is taken away, which tells us during this 3.5-year period, the daily sacrifice is going to be reinstituted. And so, in order to have a daily sacrifice, you need to have an altar. In order to have the altar, you need to have the temple. Is there a temple in Israel today? No. Is there a daily sacrifice in Israel today? No. This is still in our future. So at some point in the future, temple worship is going to be reinstituted, and for a period of several years is going to continue on. But after 3.5 years, the daily worship is going to be taken away and the abomination of desolation set up. The Antichrist, like Antiochus, is going to march himself into the temple. He's going to erect an altar, probably to himself, and sacrifice on that altar a pig, because that will defile the temple and make it impossible for the Jews to sacrifice. History repeating itself. The prototype showing what the Antichrist is going to do. And after this time, the angel continues in verse, where was I? I think of 11, so we need to be in 12. Blessed is he who waits. No, go back to verse. And from the time the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. If you sit there with your calculator and you run 1,290 days divided by 365 days a year, guess what you end up with? 3.5 years, roughly. Give or take a few days, but 3.5 years. So after 3.5 years, there's the abomination of desolation, and then there's going to be 3.5 years of intense. And when you start combining prophetic scriptures with each other, what we find is for 3.5 years, there's going to be a time of intense judgment as God literally pours his wrath out upon the earth. And the angel says in verse 12, blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. So there's a blessing for those who survive, though they will be few in number, because it will be a time of intense trouble. But after the time of trouble and judgment, there comes a time of blessing. We know it as the millennial kingdom of Jesus, as he sets up his kingdom on earth, and all things begin to be made new again. The events that we find here in chapter 11 and in chapter 12 are sure. And the angel said they were to be sealed up until the end, when they will be unsealed and fulfilled. He said it this way in verse 4 of chapter 12. I said we'd bounce around a little bit here in 12, and so we shall. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And so the angel says, look, seal up the book. It's sure, and at some point it will be unsealed and it will be fulfilled. Knowledge is going to increase. People are going to run around crazy, but it's going to happen. The prophecy that's there, Daniel sealed up the book. We still have it before us today. The prophecy is there to be understood by God's people. That's the good news. So if you get to the end of Daniel and say, wow, I understand this a lot better than I did, that's totally the point, because he said God's people would understand it. Look at verse 9. He said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. Wicked people don't get what's going on, won't get what's going on, but the wise, he said, will. And then finally he says in verse 13, that Daniel would rest, but he would arise to inheritance at the end. But you go your way till the end, for you shall rest. Daniel, you're 85 years old. You're getting ready to die. And will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. He said, Daniel, you're going to go to your rest. You're going to die, but you're going to arise and you're going to receive an inheritance at the end of days. And that's where the book of Daniel concludes. Daniel's prophecy concludes. And as we do this, and we've looked at all of this now, but there are two very striking truths that emerge to me out of these two chapters. And you may have seen others, and that's great. And I would encourage you to read it, compare it with history, see for yourself the wonder that is there. But two very striking truths, I think, emerge. Firstly, is that people, and especially rulers, will do according to their own will. We run across that phrase several times. They did according to their own will. But it will ultimately be according to God's will. Though each of these rulers did exactly what they wanted to do, all they actually did was further the will and the plan of God. Not in violation of their free will, but by the completion of their free will. They furthered the will, the word, the plan of God. Second thing I see that's striking is that God's people suffered greatly under Antiochus IV, and they will suffer greatly under the Antichrist, and they suffered under every ruler in between. Because it has always been the lot of God's people, and that includes us, to suffer at the hands of the rulers of this world, because the rulers of this world are rulers of this world, and we are citizens of another. See, I feel ostracized. I feel left out. I feel like everybody's being anti-Christian. Welcome to the party. This is how we always have felt, because we are citizens of another kingdom. And though some may have been more tolerant than others, when you think of biblical Christianity, the way the Bible presents itself, not the instituted religions of mankind, Protestant, Catholic, fill in the blank, but biblical Christianity, God's way, has never been popular with men. Because it's not about power and it's not about control. That's all religion tends to be about. And it's not about freedom and doing whatever you feel like, because that's what unreligion is all about. We're somewhere right in the middle where I don't control you, you don't control me, we don't control each other, we live responsibly before God. That means I can't do everything I want to do, but you can't tell me what to do. It's a weird place to be, but it's the biblical place to be. And so we have always been those who suffered to varying degrees at the hands of rulers. And so the question is, what are we to make of such dire conclusions of suffering for God's people? Because honestly, that doesn't sound like good news, does it? Oh, we're going to suffer. Thanks. Can we have dinner now? I mean, it just doesn't sound like good news. And I guess to a certain degree, it's not. But here's what we can kind of take away from it. Here's what we can make of these conclusions. First is understand that we as God's people will suffer. But understanding that we as God's people will suffer takes the surprise out of it, doesn't it? I mean, it's one thing to suffer. It's another thing to suffer by surprise. It makes it more doable if we at least know it's there and know it's coming. Secondly, understanding that our suffering and those who cause it still function according to God's will emboldens us when it comes. When we find ourselves suffering and we find the powerful in this world perpetrating it against the weak, against the innocent, against the godly, rather than seeing it as an injustice, rather than seeing it as a contravention of God's will, if we can understand that they're doing according to their will, but all they're doing is furthering the will, the word, the plan of God, it emboldens us to live through it. Say, does God want me to suffer? No, but it's just part of the process, and He told you it's part of the process, it's part of the plan, and that emboldens us because we know that no matter what our government does or any other government does for that matter, whatever big bully on your block may happen to do to try to make your life miserable, all they are doing is facilitating the will of God, the plan of God, the Word of God. Doesn't make suffering any more fun, but it will embolden you to live through it if you can understand that. And then finally, and here's the great hope of the last verse of Daniel, The understanding that we, like Daniel, may go to our rest, but we will rise again to an inheritance, encourages us when suffering comes. Because this life is not that long. I know it seems like forever. I remember being young. Oh, I can't believe I just said that. But I remember being a teenager thinking, wow, 30 is so old. Now I look back and go, 30, wow, that is so young. And I'm not that old. At least I don't think I am. Luke's taken to asking me, Dad, when I'm 40, how old will you be? Or no, when I'm 45. Dad, when I'm 45, how old will you be? Because I'm 45 right now. And so he says, Dad, when I'm 45, how old will you be? And I'm like, I'll be 85. I was 40. That's why we stopped where we did. 40 is kind of old to be having a baby. I said, son, I'll be 85. And, you know, when I go to the bathroom, I'm always saying, Luke, I'm done. He doesn't think that's funny. But understanding that this life is short, and even if this life is difficult all the way through, I'm going to go to my rest, and I'm going to rise again to an inheritance in God's kingdom. I'm going to rule and reign with Jesus in a kingdom that lasts for 1,000 years, and that will, after a period of short conflict where Jesus is just going to open up a can and whoop up everybody, is going to move us then into that eternal state of untold blessing. If you knew that you would get 1,000 years of life that was going to be peaceful and blessed, could you endure 80 of hardship? Yeah. And so we need to understand that though we may go to our rest, we, like Daniel, will rise again to an inheritance. And so we can be encouraged even when hardship and difficulties come our way. And that's really the point of the book of Daniel. It doesn't end on the happiest of notes except on the last verse. Daniel says it's going to get hard and it's going to get ugly. You read through the book of the Revelation, which corresponds very well with what we see here in the book of Daniel. And the death toll is going to be in the billions with a B. And literally 3/4 plus of the earth's population is going to be killed in a 7-year span. Right now, if that were to start, you're talking 6 billion people in a time of unparalleled difficulty. That's the picture that Daniel's painting here. He says, but, it's good news. Why is it good news? Because we suffer? No, because we win. Because God's will is what will happen. God's plan is what will be carried out. And God's promise is sure. And if you're not sure about how well God can make a promise, sled through Daniel chapter 11. Find 135 distinct prophecies that have been historically verified. And then think about how sure is God's promise. Does the difficulty of your life undo His promise? No. Not for a second. His promise will be carried out. And His promise to you and I and all of His children, just like it was to Daniel, is that we will rise again to an inheritance. Father, we love you. I thank you for Daniel. I thank you for the many wonders that we saw in his book. In the first half, he shows us by example how to lead an undefeated life. And in the second half, he shows us that life will be difficult, but how we can be undeterred in that life. Because ultimately, we win. Lord, we're going to face hardships this week, this month, the outset of this year, the beginning of the next. Would you help us as we do to reflect on Daniel? And if we remember nothing else, to remember that last verse, that we may go to our rest, but we will rise again to inheritance. Father, there's so much that we can be thankful for. I'm thankful this morning for your word. It's an encouragement. It emboldens us. It strengthens us to live even through times of great trial and difficulty. Not because it's easy, but because we win. Help us to see it. Help us to feel it. Help us to rest in it. And help us to be grateful for it, even as we go through difficulties. We'll thank you in Jesus' good name. Amen.